Released from prison after 20 years, an elderly woman returned to her old house only to find someone else had been living off her life. Margaret stepped out of prison carrying everything she owned in a clear plastic bag. $47. A faded photograph, and a cross she'd worn since she was 16. 20 years behind bars, reduced to something that barely weighed anything at all. What mattered wasn't how long she'd been locked up. What mattered was who had taken everything while she was gone. Because Margaret hadn't gone to prison as a criminal. She'd gone in as a woman who trusted the wrong person. She'd left behind a husband, a house that had been in her family for generations, and a sister who promised, hand on their mother's grave, to protect it all. That promise lasted exactly as long as Margaret was behind bars. By the time Margaret walked free at 72, her sister hadn't just forgotten her, she had erased her. Margaret Ellis was released from the Deborah K. Johnson Rehabilitation Center for Women in Nashville, Tennessee, on March 14, 2026. It was a Friday, cold, gray. She was 52 when she went in, young enough to still have color in her hair, strong enough to carry groceries without getting winded, old enough to know better, but she didn't. She didn't know anything at all. Now she is 72, gray-haired, stooped. Her hands shook sometimes for no reason. She had arthritis in both knees and a heart that skipped beats when she climbed stairs too fast. 20 years had taken everything from her health, her youth, her husband's final years. Robert died in 2011. Heart attack. She wasn't there, wasn't allowed to go to the funeral. Her sister Diane was supposed to handle everything. Margaret was a high school English teacher in Grover's Mill, Tennessee, a small town about 40 miles east of Nashville, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody's business, where you wave at every car that passes, where the same families have lived on the same land for 5 generations. She and Robert bought their house in 1987. It was her grandmother's house originally, a white 2-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch sitting on 3 acres of land. Her grandmother left it to her mother, and her mother left it to Margaret when she passed away in 1995. Diane got the life insurance money. Margaret got the house. That's how Mama wanted it, and that's how it was. Robert was a carpenter. Built furniture in the workshop behind the house, beautiful pieces, handcrafted from local wood, tables and chairs and cabinets that people drove from 3 counties away to buy. He wasn't a rich man, but he was a good one, honest, steady. They couldn't have children. Something was wrong with Margaret, the doctors said. They tried for years, spent money they didn't have on treatments that didn't work. Eventually, they made peace with it. They had each other. They had the house. They had their work. And Margaret had Diane, her little sister, 5 years younger, the pretty one, the wild one, the one who could talk her way into or out of anything. Their mother used to say Diane could charm the birds out of the trees, and she could. That was the problem. She could make you believe anything, make you feel anything, make you do anything, all while thinking it was your own idea. Margaret didn't see it then. She saw her baby sister, the girl she'd protected their whole lives, the girl who cried in her arms when her first husband left her, the girl who called her at 2 in the morning when she was scared or lonely or broke, the girl who needed her. That's what Margaret saw. What she didn't see was the snake coiled behind that smile. It was September 2006 when everything started to fall apart. Diane showed up at Margaret's door on a Tuesday night, crying so hard she could barely breathe. Robert was already asleep. He had a big delivery the next day, 3 dining tables going to a client in Memphis. Margaret was grading papers at the kitchen table when she heard the pounding on the door. The moment she saw her sister's face, she knew something was wrong. Diane's mascara was running. Her hands were shaking. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. "They're going to kill me, Maggie," Diane said. That's what she called her older sister, Maggie. No one else did. "They're going to kill me, and I don't know what to do." Margaret pulled her inside, made her tea, sat her down at the kitchen table, and waited while she pulled herself together enough to talk. The story Diane told went like this. She'd gotten into gambling, not just a little, a lot. Started at the casinos in Tunica, moved to underground poker games, eventually started borrowing money from people she shouldn't have borrowed from. Loan sharks, she called them. Dangerous men. She owed them $140,000, and they'd give her 30 days to pay, or they'd make an example of her. "I've seen what they do to people who don't pay," Diane whispered. "There was a man last month. They found him in a ditch outside Memphis. His hands were—" She couldn't finish. Margaret believed every word. Why wouldn't she? This was her sister, her blood. The girl she'd shared a bedroom with for 18 years. The girl she'd taught to ride a bike, helped with homework, held when she cried over boys. Why would she lie? So when Diane told her about the scheme, the way out, Margaret listened. Diane had been working as a bookkeeper for a property development company in Nashville. The owner was a man named Gerald Whitmore, and according to Diane, he was running a massive financial fraud, stealing from investors, hiding money offshore, the works. Diane had found the evidence. She had documents, records, proof of everything. "He found out I know," Diane said. "That's why he sent those men after me. It's not gambling debts, Maggie. It's him. He's trying to silence me before I can go to the authorities." Margaret should have asked questions, should have demanded to see the evidence, should have called the police right then and there. But Diane was crying. Diane was scared. Diane needed her. And Margaret had always been a fool for people who needed her. The plan, as Diane explained it, was simple. She would give Margaret copies of the documents for safekeeping. She would go to the FBI with the originals. Gerald Whitmore would be arrested, and the threat would be over. But there was a complication. "If something happens to me before I can get to the FBI," Diane said, "if Whitmore's men get to me first, someone needs to know the truth. Someone needs to be able to finish what I started." She handed Margaret a flash drive, told her it contained everything, every document, every transaction, every piece of evidence against Gerald Whitmore. "Hide this somewhere safe," Diane said, "and if I disappear, if something happens, take it to the authorities. Promise me, Maggie. Promise me you'll finish this if I can't." Margaret promised. 3 weeks later, Gerald Whitmore was dead. And 2 days after that, the police showed up at Margaret's door with a warrant for her arrest. The trial lasted 3 weeks. 17 years have passed since then, and some of it is still a blur. Even Margaret can't recall every moment. But here's what matters. The flash drive Diane gave her didn't contain financial documents. It contained detailed plans for Gerald Whitmore's murder, meeting times, security schedules, diagrams of his house, instructions written in what looked like Margaret's handwriting but wasn't. According to the prosecution, Margaret was the mastermind. She'd orchestrated the whole thing, convinced Diane to help her, used her sister's access to Whitmore's office to gather intelligence, and arranged for a man named Curtis Webb to do the actual killing. Curtis was a drifter with a record. He'd been paid $8,000 in cash. The serial numbers on those bills were traced back to a withdrawal from Margaret's personal savings account. Margaret hadn't made that withdrawal. She didn't know Curtis Webb. She'd never set foot in Gerald Whitmore's office or his house. But none of that mattered. The evidence was overwhelming. Her fingerprints were on the flash drive. The money came from her account. Her handwriting, or something close enough to fool the experts, was all over those plans. And Diane? Diane testified against her. She sat on the witness stand in a black dress, tears streaming down her face, and told the court that Margaret had manipulated her, that Margaret had a grudge against Whitmore, some story about him foreclosing on a friend's property years ago, that Margaret had threatened to hurt her if she didn't help. "I was scared of my own sister," Diane sobbed. "I didn't know what she was capable of." Margaret sat at the defense table and watched her sister lie, watched her cry those fake tears, watched her destroy her life with every word that came out of her mouth, and she still didn't understand. That's the part that haunts this story. Even then, even as Diane was sending her to prison, part of Margaret thought her sister must be confused, must be mistaken, must have been threatened or coerced into testifying. She couldn't believe Diane would do this on purpose. She couldn't believe it was real. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They came back with a verdict of guilty on all counts, conspiracy to commit murder, accessory to murder, first-degree murder under Tennessee's felony murder rule. The judge sentenced Margaret to 30 years. She was 52 years old. That sentence meant she'd be 82 before she saw the outside world again, if she lived that long. But she got lucky, if you can call it that. Good behavior, overcrowding, a compassionate release program for elderly inmates that Tennessee started in 2020. She served 20 years instead of 30. For years, Margaret held on to hope. Diane was just scared. Diane would recant. Diane would come visit and explain everything, and she'd finally understand. Diane came once, 3 months after the conviction. She sat across from Margaret in the visitation room and told her she was sorry it had to be this way. "I didn't have a choice, Maggie," Diane said. "You have to understand that. It was you or me." "What are you talking about?" Margaret asked. "What do you mean it was you or me?" But Diane wouldn't explain. Just kept saying she was sorry, that she'd take care of everything, that she'd make sure the house was maintained, that Margaret's money was safe, that everything would be waiting for her when she got out. "I swear on Mama's grave," Diane said, "I'll make this right. When you get out, you'll have everything you need to start over." That was the last time Margaret saw her sister. Diane stopped writing after year 3. Stopped accepting calls after year 5, stopped responding to letters after year 7. By year 10, Margaret had accepted that she was alone, but she still believed the promise. She still believed that when she got out, her house would be there, her savings would be there. Something would be waiting for her. She was such a fool. The prison arranged for a bus ticket back to Grover's Mill. It was a 3-hour ride from Nashville, most of it through countryside that had changed more than Margaret expected. More strip malls, more housing developments, fewer trees. She sat in the back of the bus with her plastic bag on her lap, watching Tennessee roll past the window and trying to remember what her house looked like. The wraparound porch, Robert's workshop in the back, the oak tree in the front yard that her grandmother planted when she was a girl. She hadn't told anyone she was coming. There was no one to tell. Robert was dead. Her parents were dead. She didn't have children. Her friends had long since moved on. 20 years is a long time, and people don't wait for convicted murderers to come home. There was only Diane, and Margaret didn't know where Diane was. The bus dropped her off at the gas station on Main Street just after 2 in the afternoon. The sun was out now. The morning clouds burned away, and for the first time in 20 years, she felt real warmth on her face. Not the pale sunlight of the prison yard, filtered through chain link and razor wire. Real sunlight. Free sunlight. She stood there for a moment, just breathing, in and out, feeling the air move through her lungs without anyone watching, without anyone counting, without anyone telling her when to go back inside. Then she started walking. Her house was 2 miles from the center of town. It took her almost an hour to get there. Her knees aren't what they used to be, and she had to stop twice to rest. But finally, she turned onto Miller Road, and finally, she saw it, the white farmhouse at the end of the lane, her grandmother's house, her mother's house, her house. For a moment, everything was perfect. The oak tree was still there, taller than she remembered. The wraparound porch was still there, freshly painted. The workshop in the back was still standing, and someone had put flower boxes in the windows. Then she got closer, and she saw the minivan in the driveway, and she saw the toys scattered across the front yard, and she saw the woman on the porch, young, maybe 35, pregnant, watching her approach with a confused expression on her face. "Can I help you?" the woman called out. Margaret stopped at the edge of the property. Her heart was pounding. Her hands were shaking. "This is my house," she said. The woman's expression shifted from confusion to concern. "I'm sorry," she said slowly, "but we've lived here for 16 years. I think there might be some mistake." 16 years. They'd been in Margaret's house for 16 years. The world tilted sideways. Margaret grabbed the mailbox to keep from falling. "No," she said. "No, there's no mistake. This is my house. I'm Margaret Ellis. This is my house." The woman went pale, and that's when Margaret knew. That's when she knew her sister hadn't just abandoned her. Diane had erased her. The woman on the porch was named Sarah Chen. She was 34 years old, 7 months pregnant with her third child, and she had no idea that the house she'd been living in for 16 years had been stolen from someone. "I think you should come inside," Sarah said slowly, her hand resting protectively on her belly. "I think we need to talk." Margaret couldn't move. She was staring at the house, her house, trying to reconcile what she was seeing with what she'd spent 20 years believing. The flower boxes in the windows, the new mailbox with Chen painted on the side, the swing set in the backyard where Robert's garden used to be. 20 years of holding on to hope, 20 years of telling herself that when she got out, something would be waiting for her. "Ma'am?" Sarah's voice was gentle, concerned. "Are you okay? Do you need to sit down?" Margaret's knees buckled. She would have fallen right there on the sidewalk if Sarah hadn't rushed down the porch steps and caught her arm. "Let's get you inside," Sarah said. "Come on, nice and slow." Sarah made tea, put a plate of cookies on the table, sat down across from Margaret with that worried expression still on her face. "Now," Sarah said, "tell me everything." "From the beginning," Margaret told her. "All of it. The arrest, the trial, the conviction, the 20 years in prison. The sister who promised to take care of everything and then vanished." Sarah listened without interrupting. Her face went through about 15 different emotions: confusion, disbelief, horror, anger, and finally something that looked a lot like guilt. When Margaret finished, Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "We bought this house in 2009, she finally said. "My husband and I. We'd just gotten married, and we were looking for something outside the city, somewhere quiet to raise a family." She paused, took a breath. "The seller was a woman named Diane Ellis. She said it was her family's property, that her parents had passed away and her sister had died. She said she couldn't bear to live here anymore with all the memories. She seemed so sad about it. So genuine." Margaret felt something twist in her chest. "She told you I was dead?" Sarah nodded slowly. "She had paperwork, death certificate, probate documents, everything. It all looked legitimate. Our lawyer checked everything. The title was clear. The sale was legal." "It wasn't legal," Margaret said. "I wasn't dead. I was in prison. And that house, this house, was mine. My grandmother left it to my mother, and my mother left it to me. Diane had no right to sell it." Sarah's hands were shaking now. "Oh God. Oh my God. We've been living in a stolen house for 16 years. Our children were born here. This is our home, and it was never really ours." She started to cry. Margaret reached across the table and took Sarah's hand. "This isn't your fault," Margaret said. "You didn't know. You couldn't have known. My sister fooled everyone. She fooled me for 40 years. You never stood a chance." Sarah wiped her eyes. "What are you going to do? Are you going to? I mean, legally, if this house is yours." Margaret looked around the kitchen, at the refrigerator covered in children's drawings, at the family photos on the wall, at the evidence of 16 years of life and love and memories. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I don't know anything right now. I just got out of prison this morning. I don't have a lawyer. I don't have money. I don't even have a place to sleep tonight." Sarah's expression shifted. Something hardened in her eyes, not against Margaret, but against the situation, against the injustice of it all. "You'll stay here tonight," Sarah said firmly. "We have a guest room, and tomorrow we're going to figure this out together. I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm offering." Sarah squeezed Margaret's hand. "What your sister did to you is monstrous, and I don't care what it takes or how long it takes. We're going to make this right." Sarah's husband came home 2 hours later. His name was David, and he was an accountant, quiet, methodical, the kind of man who looked at problems like puzzles to be solved. When Sarah explained the situation, David didn't say anything for a long time. He just sat there, processing, his expression growing darker with every detail. "The paperwork was forged," he finally said. "The death certificate, the probate documents, all of it. Someone went to a lot of trouble to make this sale look legitimate." "My sister," Margaret said. "Diane. She worked as a bookkeeper. She knew how to manipulate financial records. She must have known how to forge legal documents too. David nodded slowly. We need to see those original documents, the ones from our purchase, and we need to find out exactly what happened to your assets, the house, your savings, everything. There was money, Margaret said. $180,000 in a safe in the basement. My life savings. Diane knew where it was. She knew the combination. She was supposed to use it to pay the property taxes while I was gone. Sarah and David exchanged a look. There's no safe in the basement, Sarah said quietly. We've been down there 100 times. There's nothing but storage and the furnace. Margaret's heart sank, but some part of her had already known. Some part of her had known the moment she saw strangers living in her house that everything was gone. She took it all, Margaret whispered. 20 years. She took 20 years of my life, and then she took everything else too. That night, Margaret slept in the guest room of her own house. The room that used to be her sewing room, where she'd made curtains and quilts and Halloween costumes for the neighbors' children. Now it had pale blue walls and a queen-sized bed and framed photos of the Chen family's vacations. She lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it all. Why? That was the question that kept circling in her mind. Why would Diane do this? What had Margaret ever done to deserve this kind of betrayal? They'd been sisters. They'd been close, or at least Margaret thought they'd been close. She'd protected Diane their whole lives, bailed her out of trouble, lent her money, let her cry on her shoulder through 2 divorces and countless bad decisions, and in return, Diane had framed her for murder, stolen her house, taken her savings, told everyone she was dead. Why? Margaret didn't have an answer. She wasn't sure she ever would. But as the sun started to rise over the Tennessee hills, painting the guest room in shades of gold and pink, she made a decision. She was going to find out. The next few weeks were a blur of legal offices and government buildings and paperwork. So much paperwork. David Chen turned out to be exactly the kind of person you want in your corner when you're trying to untangle 2 decades of fraud. He was methodical, patient, and absolutely relentless. He took time off work to help Margaret navigate the bureaucracy, drove her to appointments, made phone calls on her behalf. Sarah was just as determined. She researched legal aid organizations, found pro bono attorneys who specialized in fraud cases, and refused to let Margaret feel like a burden. "You're not imposing," Sarah told her one evening when Margaret tried to apologize for the 100th time. "You're family now. That's how this works." Family. The word hit Margaret like a punch to the chest. She'd had family once, a sister who was supposed to love her, and look how that turned out. But the Chens were different. Margaret could see that now. They weren't helping her because they had to or because they felt guilty. They were helping her because it was the right thing to do. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything. 3 weeks after Margaret's release, they got their first real break. David had been digging through county records, trying to trace the paper trail of the house sale. He'd found the original deed transfer, the forged death certificate, and the probate documents that Diane had used to claim ownership of the property. But he'd also found something else. She didn't just sell the house, David said, spreading documents across the kitchen table. She liquidated everything. Your husband's workshop equipment, sold to an antique dealer in Nashville for $12,000. Your furniture, sold at an estate sale in 2008. Your mother's china, your family photographs, your clothes, all of it. She even sold your car. Margaret stared at the documents, sale receipts, bank transfers, a detailed accounting of everything she'd ever owned, converted to cash and deposited into an account under Diane's name. "How much?" Margaret asked, her voice hollow. "Total. How much did she take?" David hesitated. "The house sold for $215,000. The contents brought in another $38,000, combined with the cash you said was in the safe. $180,000. That's $433,000, give or take. $433,000. Her entire life. Everything she and Robert had built together. Everything her parents and grandparents had left her. Gone. All of it. Stolen by the sister she would have died for. "Where did it go?" Margaret asked. "The money. Where did she put it?" "That's where it gets complicated," David said. "The account was closed in 2010. The funds were transferred to a bank in Arizona. After that, the trail goes cold. Margaret filed that away. It wasn't much, but it was something, a direction, a place to start looking. There's something else," David said. He looked uncomfortable now, hesitant. "I found the police reports from your case, the original investigation, and the man who was killed, Gerald Whitmore. He wasn't just some random businessman." David pulled out another document. He was Diane's boyfriend. They'd been seeing each other for almost a year before his death. The room went silent. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. What? According to the police reports, they were having an affair. Whitmore was married, but he and Diane were planning to run away together. He was going to leave his wife, liquidate his assets, and start over with Diane in another state. But Diane testified against me. She said I was the one who wanted Whitmore dead. She said I had a grudge against him. She lied. David's voice was flat, hard. She lied about everything, and I think I know why. He pulled out one more document, a life insurance policy. Gerald Whitmore had a $2 million life insurance policy, David said. His wife was the primary beneficiary, but there was a secondary beneficiary listed, someone who would receive the payout if the wife was also deceased or if she was convicted of involvement in his death. Margaret's hands were shaking. Who? A woman named Diana Wilson. Except Diana Wilson didn't exist before 2005. She was a fabricated identity. David met Margaret's eyes. The Social Security number associated with Diana Wilson was issued to Diane Marie Ellis in 1972. The room spun. Margaret grabbed the edge of the table. "Diane killed him," she whispered. "She killed Gerald Whitmore, framed me for it, and collected $2 million in insurance money. That's what the evidence suggests. Yes, $2 million, plus the $400,000 she'd stolen from Margaret, plus whatever else she'd accumulated in the 16 years since. Diane hadn't just betrayed her sister. She'd executed a perfect crime. She'd gotten away with murder, literally, and built a new life on the wreckage of everyone she'd destroyed. And Margaret had spent 20 years in prison paying for it. The legal aid attorney's name was Jessica Huang. She was 29 years old, 3 years out of law school, and she worked for the Tennessee Innocence Project. When David Chen sent her Margaret's case file, Jessica read it 3 times in one night. Then she called David at 6 in the morning and said 4 words that would change everything. "I believe her. I'm in." Jessica was young, but she was fierce. She had the kind of energy that comes from genuine outrage, the kind that refuses to accept injustice as just the way things are. "This case is a disaster," Jessica said at their first meeting, spreading documents across the conference table. "The original investigation was sloppy at best, corrupt at worst. They had a suspect who fit their narrative, and they stopped looking. They never investigated Diane's relationship with Whitmore. They never questioned the forged documents. They never even verified that the so-called gambling debts existed." "Can you prove I'm innocent?" Margaret asked. Jessica hesitated. "Proving innocence after 20 years is complicated. Evidence disappears. Witnesses die or forget. But what I can do is prove that your conviction was based on fraudulent evidence and perjured testimony. I can prove that Diane manufactured the entire case against you. And then what? Then we petition for exoneration. We get your record cleared. And we build a civil case against Diane for fraud, theft, and conspiracy." Jessica leaned forward, her eyes blazing. "Margaret, what your sister did to you isn't just a betrayal, it's a crime, multiple crimes. And I'm going to make sure she answers for every single one of them." For the first time in 20 years, Margaret felt something she'd almost forgotten how to feel: hope. Jessica hired a private investigator named Marcus Cole, a former FBI agent who specialized in tracking people who didn't want to be found. He was expensive, but Jessica's firm agreed to cover the cost as part of their pro bono commitment to Margaret's case. Marcus started with the Arizona bank account David had found. From there, he traced a series of wire transfers, shell companies, and identity changes that painted a picture of someone who was very, very good at disappearing. "Your sister's been busy," Marcus reported after 2 weeks of investigation. "She's used at least 4 different identities since 2006. Diana Wilson, Diane Mitchell, Diana Wells, and most recently, Diana Hartley. She moves every few years, changes her name, her appearance, her history. She's currently married to a man named Richard Hartley, retired surgeon, widower, net worth around $8 million. Margaret closed her eyes. Of course, Diane had found another mark, another victim, another person to manipulate and eventually destroy. Where is she? Scottsdale, Arizona, gated community. Very exclusive. She's been there for about 6 years. Marcus paused. There's something else you should know. What? She's sick. According to medical records, my contact was able to access, and don't ask me how. Diana Hartley was diagnosed with stage 3 pancreatic cancer 8 months ago. She's undergoing treatment, but the prognosis isn't good. Stage 3 pancreatic cancer. Margaret didn't know how to feel about that. Part of her wanted to feel satisfied, karmic justice, divine retribution, whatever you wanted to call it. But mostly she just felt tired. How long does she have? Doctors are saying 6 months to a year, maybe less. So Diane was dying. The sister who had stolen everything from her, her freedom, her home, her savings, her husband's final years, was dying. And Margaret still had questions. Questions that only Diane could answer. Why? Why had she done it? Why had she targeted her own sister? Why had she destroyed Margaret's life to build her own? There had to be a reason. Something Margaret didn't know. Something that would make all of this make sense. She looked at Jessica, then at Marcus, then at David and Sarah Chen, who had come to every meeting, who had supported her through every revelation. "I need to see her," Margaret said. "I need to talk to Diane face to face." Jessica frowned. "Margaret, I don't think that's a good idea. If she knows we're on to her, she could destroy evidence, flee the country, anything. She's dying. She's not going anywhere." Margaret's voice was steady now. "Certain. I didn't spend 20 years in prison to get answers from a courtroom. I need to hear it from her. I need to look her in the eye and ask her why." Jessica started to argue, but Sarah put a hand on her arm. "Let her do this," Sarah said quietly. "She's earned the right." Jessica sighed, looked at Margaret for a long moment. "Okay," she finally said. "We'll go to Arizona, but we do this my way. We document everything. We record every conversation. And the moment she says anything incriminating, we use it to bury her." Margaret nodded. It was time to confront the sister who had stolen her life. The flight from Nashville to Phoenix took 3 hours and 47 minutes. Margaret spent most of it staring out the window, watching the country roll past beneath her. The green hills of Tennessee giving way to the brown plains of Texas, then the rust-red deserts of New Mexico and Arizona. She'd never been on a plane before, never had a reason to go anywhere that far. Her whole life had been contained within a 50-mile radius of Grover's Mill, the house where she was born, the school where she taught, the church where she married Robert, the prison where she'd spent the last 2 decades. Now she was flying across the country to confront the sister who had put her there. Jessica sat beside, her reviewing documents on her laptop. They'd spent the last week preparing for this trip, gathering evidence, rehearsing questions, planning for every possible scenario. Jessica had wanted to bring Marcus, the private investigator, but Margaret had refused. "This is between me and Diane," she'd said. "I don't want her to feel ambushed. I want her to talk." Jessica had argued, but eventually relented. She understood, even if she didn't agree. This wasn't just a legal matter anymore. This was personal. This was family. Whatever that word even meant anymore. They landed in Phoenix at 2:15 inches the afternoon. The heat hit Margaret like a physical force the moment she stepped off the plane, dry and relentless. Nothing like the humid Tennessee summers she'd grown up with. Even the air smelled different here, like dust and sage and something vaguely chemical. They rented a car and drove to Scottsdale. The city was nothing like Margaret had expected, all glass and chrome and perfectly manicured lawns that seemed to defy the desert around them. Money? That's what this place smelled like, underneath the dust. Money and the desperate effort to pretend you weren't living in the middle of nowhere. Diane's neighborhood was called Desert Crown Estates. Gated community, private security, the kind of place where houses cost more than most people made in a lifetime. Jessica pulled up to the gate and rolled down her window. "We're here to see Diana Hartley," she said to the guard. "She's expecting us." That was a lie, of course. Diane had no idea they were coming, but Jessica had called ahead, pretending to be from a charity organization that Diana Hartley had supposedly donated to. She'd gotten the address, the gate code, and confirmation that Mrs. Hartley was home. The guard checked his clipboard, frowned, made a phone call. Margaret held her breath. "Go ahead," the guard finally said, waving them through. The gate opened. They drove inside. Diane's house was at the end of a cul-de-sac, a sprawling single-story mansion with a red tile roof and a circular driveway. There was a fountain in the front yard, actual water, in the middle of the desert, and a row of palm trees that must have cost a fortune to maintain. Jessica parked the car and turned to Margaret. "Are you ready?" Margaret looked at the house, at the life her sister had built on the wreckage of everything she'd destroyed. "No," she said, "but I'm going anyway." They walked up to the front door together. Jessica rang the bell. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Margaret heard footsteps, slow, shuffling. The footsteps of someone who was sick. The door opened, and there she was, Diane, 20 years older, thinner than Margaret remembered. Her hair was gone, chemotherapy, probably, and she wore a silk scarf wrapped around her head. Her face was gaunt, her skin sallow, her eyes sunken. But those eyes, Margaret would have recognized those eyes anywhere. The same pale blue as their mother's, the same sharp intelligence, the same calculating coldness that Margaret had somehow never noticed until now. Diane stared at her sister. For a moment, her expression was blank, uncomprehending. Then recognition dawned, and Diane smiled. "Maggie," she said, her voice thin and raspy, "I was wondering when you'd find me." The inside of Diane's house was exactly what Margaret had expected. Expensive, tasteful, cold. Everything was white or cream or pale gray, like a showroom that no one actually lived in. There were no family photos on the walls, no personal touches. Nothing that suggested a real human being occupied this space. Diane led them to a sitting room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the desert. She moved slowly, carefully, one hand pressed against her stomach like she was holding herself together. "Please, sit," Diane said, gesturing to a white leather sofa. "Can I get you anything? Water? Tea?" "We're not here for tea," Margaret said. She hadn't sat down, couldn't sit down. She stood in the middle of the room, her hands clenched at her sides, staring at the sister she hadn't seen in 20 years. Diane lowered herself into an armchair, wincing slightly as she settled. "No, I suppose you're not." She looked at Jessica. "And who's this? Your lawyer?" "My name is Jessica Huang. I'm with the Tennessee Innocence Project." "Ah." Diane nodded slowly. "So you figured it out then. Took you long enough." Margaret felt something snap inside her. "Took me long enough?" Her voice came out louder than she intended. "I spent 20 years in prison, Diane. 20 years. You framed me for murder. You stole my house. You took everything I had. And all you can say is it took me long enough?" Diane's expression didn't change. If anything, she looked almost bored. "What do you want me to say, Maggie? That I'm sorry? That I regret what I did?" She shrugged, a small, delicate gesture that somehow contained more contempt than Margaret had ever seen. "I don't. I did what I had to do. You were just collateral damage. Collateral damage. 20 years. Robert dying alone. Her house was sold. Her savings were stolen. Her life was erased. Why?" The word tore out of Margaret like something physical. "Why did you do this to me? What did I ever do to you?" Diane looked at her for a long moment. Then she laughed, a dry, bitter sound that turned into a cough. What did you ever do to me? Diane repeated. Oh, Maggie, you really don't know, do you? After all these years, you still don't understand. Then explain it to me. That's why I'm here. I need to understand. Diane was quiet for a moment. Her eyes drifted to the window, to the desert landscape beyond. You want to know why I did what I did, she said slowly. Fine, I'll tell you. But you're not going to like it. I'm not looking for something I like. I'm looking for the truth. Diane smiled again, that cold, calculating smile that Margaret was beginning to realize she'd never really seen before. Not clearly, not for what it was. The truth? Diane said. All right, Maggie, let me tell you the truth. She started with their childhood, the house in Grover's Mill, the family they'd grown up in. You were always Mama's favorite, Diane said. Did you know that? Of course you did. Everyone knew it. Perfect Margaret, responsible Margaret. Margaret, who got straight A's and never broke the rules and always did exactly what she was supposed to do. That's not. Don't interrupt me. You wanted the truth. Here it is. Margaret fell silent. Mama loved you, Diane continued, really loved you, the way a mother is supposed to love a daughter. But me? I was the problem child, the difficult one, the one who was always getting into trouble, always needing to be bailed out, always disappointing everyone. Mama loved you too, Diane. She loved both of us. No, she didn't. Diane's voice was flat, certain. She tolerated me. She was embarrassed by me. And when she died, she made sure everyone knew exactly where I stood in this family. What are you talking about? The inheritance, Maggie. Don't pretend you don't remember. Margaret shook her head. You got the life insurance money. I got the house. That's what Mama wanted. That's what Mama wanted. Diane repeated the words like they were poison. Do you have any idea how much the life insurance was worth? I don't know. 40,000? 50? Diane laughed. That dry, bitter laugh again. $23,000, Maggie. That's what I got. $23,000. And you got a house worth $200,000 plus 3 acres of land plus everything inside it. Mama's china, Grandma's jewelry, Daddy's tools, everything. Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. She'd never thought about it that way, never done the math. I didn't know, she said quietly. I didn't realize. Of course you didn't, because you never had to. You were the favorite. You got everything handed to you, and I got the scraps. That's not fair, Diane. I didn't ask for the house. I didn't ask for any of it. But you took it, didn't you? You took it, and you never once thought about whether it was right, whether maybe your sister deserved something more than $23,000 and a pat on the head. Margaret didn't know what to say. She stood there, frozen, watching her sister's face twist with decades of resentment. I spent years trying to make something of myself, Diane continued. I married twice, both disasters. I worked jobs that went nowhere. I watched you living in that beautiful house with your perfect husband while I scraped by in apartments and trailers and whatever else I could afford. I would have helped you. If you'd asked, I didn't want your help. Diane's voice rose sharply, then fell back to that cold monotone. I didn't want your charity. I wanted what was mine, what should have been mine from the beginning. So you framed me for murder? That was your solution? Diane was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, almost thoughtful. Gerald was my way out. He was rich, successful, willing to leave his wife for me. We had plans, Maggie. Real plans. He was going to divorce his wife, liquidate his assets, and we were going to start over somewhere new. Together, but something went wrong, Jessica said. It was the first time she'd spoken since they sat down. Diane glanced at her, then back at Margaret. His wife found out about us, threatened to take him for everything in the divorce. Gerald panicked, said he couldn't leave her after all. Said it was too risky, too expensive. Diane's expression hardened. He was going to abandon me, just like everyone else. So you killed him, Margaret said. I did what I had to do. Diane's voice was matter-of-fact, like she was discussing the weather. Gerald had a life insurance policy, $2 million, and I knew about the secondary beneficiary clause. I'd helped him set it up, actually. All I had to do was make sure his wife couldn't collect by framing her for his murder. That was the original plan, yes, but his wife had an alibi. She was at a charity gala the night Gerald died. Hundreds of witnesses. Diane shrugged. I needed another scapegoat, someone without an alibi, someone the police would believe could do something like this. Me, you. Diane met Margaret's eyes without flinching. I knew you'd come running if I showed up crying. You always did. And I knew you'd do anything to protect me. So I gave you the flash drive. I gave you the evidence. And then I tipped off the police about where to look. The handwriting on those documents, forged. I spent months practicing your handwriting. You used to send me birthday cards, Christmas cards, letters when I was going through my divorces. I had plenty of samples to work from. The money from my bank account. I had a power of attorney. You signed it years ago, remember? When Robert had his first heart attack and you wanted someone to be able to access your accounts if something happened to you. Diane smiled. You made it so easy, Maggie. You trusted me. And I used every bit of that trust against you. Margaret felt like she was going to be sick. 20 years, she whispered. You let me rot in prison for 20 years? You told everyone I was dead. You sold my house. You stole my money. And for what? Because Mama left me the house instead of you? It wasn't just the house. Diane's voice was sharp now, defensive. It was everything. My whole life, I was the afterthought, the disappointment, the one nobody believed in. And you had everything. The house, the husband, the career, the respect. You had everything I ever wanted, and you didn't even appreciate it. So you took it. I took what should have been mine. Margaret stared at her. Sister. At this woman she'd spent her whole life protecting, loving, sacrificing for, and she realized, with a clarity that was almost painful, that she'd never known Diane at all. The sister she loved had never existed. She was a mask, a performance, a lie that Diane had been telling for 50 years. You're a monster, Margaret said quietly. You destroyed my life because you were jealous. That's all this was. Jealousy. Call it whatever you want. I got what I deserved. You got $2 million in insurance money, $400,000 of my money, and a dying husband worth $8 million more. Margaret's voice was rising now. How much is enough, Diane? How much do you have to steal before you feel like you've gotten what you deserve? Diane didn't answer. She just sat there watching Margaret with those cold blue eyes. I'm dying, you know, she finally said. Pancreatic cancer. 6 months, maybe less. So whatever revenge you're planning, you'd better hurry. I don't want revenge. Then what do you want? Margaret was quiet for a long moment. She looked around the room, at the expensive furniture, the tasteful artwork, the evidence of a life built on lies and theft and murder. I want you to confess, she said. I want you to tell the truth. I want the world to know what you did to me, to Gerald Whitmore, to everyone you've ever used and discarded. Diane laughed. And why would I do that? Because you're dying. Because in 6 months, none of this, Margaret gestured at the room around them, none of this is going to matter. You can't take it with you, Diane, but you can leave this world with a clear conscience. You can finally, for once in your life, do the right thing. The right thing. Diane repeated the words like they were a joke. Maggie, I've never done the right thing in my life. It's a little late to start now. It's never too late. For you, maybe. You were always the good one, the forgiving one. Diane's voice dripped with contempt. But I'm not like you. I never was. And I'm not going to spend my last months on Earth in a courtroom being judged by people who don't know me, who don't understand what I've been through. What have you been through? Margaret couldn't believe what she was hearing. Diane, you murdered a man. You framed your own sister. You stole everything I had. And you're the victim here? I survived. Diane's voice was hard now, final. That's what I did. I survived. And I'm not apologizing for it. The room fell silent. Margaret stood there, looking at her sister, feeling something shift inside her. For 20 years, she'd held on to hope, hope that there was an explanation, hope that Diane had a reason, a real reason, for what she'd done, hope that somewhere, underneath all the lies, The sister she loved was still there. That hope died in this room. There was nothing here. Nothing but a dying woman who felt no remorse for the lives she'd destroyed. Margaret turned to Jessica. "Get it on record," she said quietly. "All of it. I want the world to know." Jessica nodded. She'd been recording the entire conversation on her phone. Diane had consented to it, apparently believing she was untouchable. She was wrong. Diane Marie Ellis, Jessica said formally, also known as Diana Wilson, Diana Mitchell, Diana Wells, and Diana Hartley. This conversation has been recorded and will be submitted as evidence to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, the Arizona Attorney General's Office, and the federal authorities. You have just confessed to first-degree murder, fraud, perjury, and conspiracy. Whatever time you have left, I suggest you spend it with a good lawyer. Diane's expression flickered. For the first time, Margaret saw something like fear in her sister's eyes. "You can't prove any of this," Diane said. "It's my word against yours. It's your words, Diane, recorded on tape. Admissible in court." Jessica smiled grimly. "You just confessed to everything. And I'm going to make sure everyone hears it." Diane's face went pale. She opened her mouth to say something, to argue, to threaten, to bargain, but Margaret was already walking toward the door. "Goodbye, Diane," she said without turning around. "I hope whatever time you have left is worth what you paid for it." She walked out of the house. She didn't look back. They drove in silence for 20 minutes before Jessica finally spoke. "Are you okay?" Margaret stared out the window at the desert, at the endless brown landscape stretching toward the horizon. "No," she said, "but I will be." What she said back there, about your mother, about the inheritance, "You know that's not your fault, right? You didn't do anything wrong." "I know." Margaret's voice was quiet, but she's right about one thing. I never thought about it. I never considered how it might have felt for her, watching me get everything while she got nothing. I was so busy being grateful that I never stopped to ask if it was fair. That doesn't justify what she did. No, it doesn't. Margaret turned to look at Jessica. But it explains it, and I think I needed that. I needed to understand why. And now that you do? Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "Now I let it go," she said. "I spent 20 years in prison because I loved my sister more than I loved myself. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life hating her. She's already taken enough from me." Jessica reached over and squeezed Margaret's hand. "You're a better person than I am," she said. "I'd want her to suffer. She is suffering. She's dying alone in a beautiful house full of things that can't love her back. That's punishment enough." Margaret paused. "Besides, I have something she'll never have." "What's that?" "People who care about me. Real people. Not marks, not victims, not sources of money or status." Margaret smiled, a small, tired smile, but genuine. "The Chens, you, Marcus. I walked out of prison with nothing, and somehow I ended up with more than Diane will ever have." Jessica was quiet for a moment. "We're going to get your conviction overturned," she finally said. "With her confession on tape, with all the evidence we've gathered, it's going to happen, Margaret. You're going to be exonerated, I know, and we're going to recover as much of your money as we can. Diane's assets will be frozen. Her husband will probably file for divorce when he finds out who he really married. There's going to be a lot of money to go around. I don't care about the money, I know, but you deserve it anyway." Margaret nodded. She did deserve it. After everything she'd been through, she deserved something good. But more than the money, more than the exoneration, more than anything else, she deserved peace. The flight back to Tennessee felt different than the flight out. Margaret sat by the window again, watching the desert give way to plains, the plains give way to hills, the hills give way to the green forests of home. But this time, she wasn't dreading what she'd find at the end of the journey. This time, she knew exactly what was waiting for her. Answers, closure, and the beginning of something new. Jessica worked on her laptop the whole flight, already drafting the petition for exoneration, already outlining the civil case against Diane, already building the legal framework that would give Margaret her life back. or at least what was left of it. "The recording is solid," Jessica said, not looking up from her screen. "Her confession is clear and unambiguous. Combined with the documentary evidence David gathered and Marcus's investigation, we have more than enough to reopen your case. How long will it take?" "The exoneration?" "Normally, these things can drag on for years, but with a recorded confession from the actual perpetrator?" Jessica smiled grimly. "I'm going to push for expedited review. 6 months, maybe less. 6 months. After 20 years, 6 months felt like nothing, like the blink of an eye. And Diane?" Jessica's expression hardened. "That's trickier. She's dying. The Arizona authorities will file charges, but there's a real possibility she won't live long enough to stand trial. So she gets away with it." "No," Jessica shook her head firmly. "She doesn't get away with anything. Even if she dies before trial, her confession is public record. Her husband is already being notified. Her assets are being frozen. Everything she built on your suffering is going to come crashing down around her." Margaret nodded slowly. It wasn't the justice she'd imagined. Diane in handcuffs. Diane in a courtroom. Diane finally facing the consequences of what she'd done. But it was something. And maybe, Margaret was starting to realize, something was enough. They landed in Nashville just after sunset. David Chen was waiting for them at the airport, his face anxious until he saw them coming through the arrival's gate. "How did it go?" he asked, pulling Margaret into a gentle hug. "Sarah's been worried sick. She wanted to come, but the doctor said no flying this close to her due date. It went. Margaret didn't have the words to describe what had happened in that house in Arizona. The confrontation, the confession, the final, painful death of the hope she'd been carrying for 20 years. "I got what I needed," she confessed. "To everything. We have it on tape." David closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, they were bright with something that looked like relief. "It's over, then. It's really over." "Not yet," Jessica said. "We still have a lot of work to do. But the hard part is done. Margaret's going to be exonerated. I'd stake my career on it." They drove back to Grover's Mill in David's car, the three of them quiet for most of the journey. Margaret watched the Tennessee landscape roll past, familiar now in a way it hadn't been when she'd first come home. The winding roads, the old barns, the church steeples rising above the trees. This was her home. It had always been her home. And no matter what Diane had done, no matter how much she'd stolen, she couldn't take that away. Sarah was waiting on the porch when they pulled into the driveway. She was huge now, due any day, according to her doctor, but she came down the steps as fast as she could manage, her face wet with tears. "You're back," she said, pulling Margaret into an awkward, belly-obstructed hug. "Thank God you're back. I've been going crazy waiting to hear what happened." "I'm back," Margaret said, "and I'm okay, really." They went inside. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, her kitchen table, in her house. Even if the furniture was different and the walls were painted colors she never would have chosen, and she told them everything. The confrontation, the confession, the decades of resentment that had festered in Diane's heart until it turned into something monstrous. When she finished, Sarah was crying openly. David's jaw was clenched so tight Margaret could see the muscles working. "She blamed you," Sarah said, her voice thick with anger. "She destroyed your life because she was jealous of you, and she still found a way to make it your fault. That's who she is," Margaret said quietly. "That's who she's always been. I just didn't see it. How could you? She was your sister. You loved her. I loved who I thought she was, the real Diane." Margaret shook her head. "I don't think I ever knew her. Not really." David reached across the table and took Margaret's hand. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we wait," Jessica said. "I'm filing the petition for exoneration first thing Monday morning. I've already been in touch with the Tennessee Attorney General's office. They're taking this very seriously. And the Arizona authorities are opening a murder investigation based on Diane's confession." "And the house?" Sarah asked, her hand moving unconsciously to her belly. "I know this is selfish, but what happens to us?" Margaret looked at her. At this young woman who had opened her home to a stranger, who had treated Margaret like family when her own family had abandoned her. "Nothing happens to you," Margaret said firmly. "You bought this house in good faith. You've lived here for 16 years. Your children were born here. I'm not going to take that away from you, but it's your house. Legally, morally, it's yours." "It was my grandmother's house," Margaret corrected gently. "Then it was my mother's house. Then it was mine. And now—" She looked around the kitchen, at the family photos on the refrigerator, at the children's drawings taped to the walls. "Now it's yours. That's how it should be. That's how my grandmother would have wanted it." Sarah started crying again. "Margaret, we can't just—" "Yes, you can, and you will." Margaret's voice was firm but kind. "I don't need this house anymore. I don't need the memories it holds. What I need is to start over, to build something new, and I can't do that if I'm clinging to the past." "But where will you go?" Margaret smiled, the first real smile she'd felt in a long time. "I don't know yet, but that's okay. For the first time in 20 years, I get to choose." The next few months moved faster than Margaret had expected. Jessica filed the petition for exoneration on Monday morning, just like she'd promised. By Wednesday, the Tennessee Attorney General's office had launched a formal review of Margaret's case. By Friday, the story had broken in the national news. Woman freed after 20 years. Sister's deathbed confession reveals elaborate frame-up. The headlines were everywhere. Margaret's face. The old mugshot from 2006 and a recent photo taken by Sarah was on every news channel, every website, every newspaper in the country. Reporters called constantly. They showed up at the house, camped out on the street, tried to get interviews with anyone who would talk to them. David and Sarah handled most of it, shielding Margaret from the chaos as best they could. But in some interviews, Margaret agreed to do it herself. She sat on the porch of her grandmother's house, the Chenz's house, it didn't matter anymore, and told her story to a journalist from the New York Times. She spoke calmly, clearly, without bitterness or self-pity. "I'm not angry anymore," she said when the journalist asked how she felt about her sister. "Anger takes too much energy, and I've already given Diane 20 years of my life. I'm not giving her any more. Do you forgive her?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know if forgiveness is the right word," she finally said. "I understand her. I understand why she did what she did, even if I can't justify it. And I've accepted that the sister I loved never really existed. She was a story Diane told to manipulate me, to use me. And how does that feel? To know you were manipulated by someone you trusted so completely? It feels—" Margaret paused, searching for the right words. "It feels like waking up from a very long dream. Everything I thought I knew about my life, about my family, about myself, none of it was real. And that's a hard thing to accept. But it's also liberating, in a way. How so? Because I'm not carrying it anymore. The weight of loving someone who didn't love me back, the guilt of wondering what I did wrong, the hope that someday she'd explain, and I'd finally understand." Margaret smiled sadly. She explained, "I understand. And now I can let it go." The exoneration came through in April, 4 months after Margaret's return to Tennessee. Jessica had pushed for expedited review, and the Attorney General's office had delivered. With Diane's confession on tape, with documentary evidence of fraud and forgery, with Marcus's investigation proving that Diane had orchestrated the entire scheme, there was no room for doubt. Margaret Ellis was innocent. She had always been innocent. The hearing was brief. Margaret stood in the same courtroom where she'd been convicted 20 years earlier, wearing a simple blue dress that Sarah had helped her pick out. Jessica stood beside her, David and Sarah in the gallery behind them. The judge read the findings, the fraudulent evidence, the perjured testimony, the calculated manipulation of an innocent woman by her own sister. "Miss Ellis," the judge said, looking at Margaret over his glasses, "on behalf of the state of Tennessee, I offer you our deepest apologies. You have been grievously wronged by this system, and while no words can give you back the years you've lost, I hope this ruling can offer you some measure of closure." He struck the gavel. Margaret Rose Ellis, your conviction is hereby vacated. You are exonerated of all charges. This court finds you fully and completely innocent. The gallery erupted. Sarah was crying. David was clapping. Jessica was hugging Margaret so tight she could barely breathe. But Margaret just stood there, quiet and still, feeling something she hadn't felt in 20 years. Free. She was finally, truly free. 2 weeks after the exoneration, Margaret received word that Diane had died. The cancer had moved faster than the doctors expected. She'd passed quietly in her sleep, alone in a hospital room in Scottsdale. Her husband had filed for divorce the day after learning about her past. Her assets had been frozen pending the fraud investigation. She died with nothing except the secrets she'd carried her whole life. Margaret didn't go to the funeral. There was no funeral to go to. Diane had no one left who would have arranged one. Her body was cremated by the state, her ashes scattered in some anonymous location. It was, Margaret thought, exactly the ending Diane had earned. Alone, forgotten, unmourned. But she didn't feel satisfied. She didn't feel vindication. She just felt tired, and maybe, underneath the exhaustion, something like pity. Diane had spent her whole life taking from others, manipulating, scheming, destroying anyone who got in her way. And in the end, what had it gotten her? A beautiful house full of things that couldn't love her back. A husband who abandoned her the moment he learned the truth. A death that no one would remember or mourn. Margaret thought about the life she'd lost. The 20 years in prison. The husband who died without her. The house that had been sold. The savings that had been stolen. The entire existence that had been erased. But she also thought about what she'd gained. The Chens, who had become family in a way Diane never was. Jessica, who had fought for her when no one else would. The outpouring of support from strangers across the country who had heard her story and been moved by it. She'd lost everything, and somehow she'd ended up with more than she'd ever had before. The civil settlement came through in June. Diane's estate, what was left of it after the divorce and the legal fees, was awarded to Margaret as restitution. It wasn't the full amount Diane had stolen, but it was substantial. Nearly $800,000 once all the accounts were liquidated and the properties were sold. "What are you going to do with it?" Sarah asked one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the Tennessee hills. Margaret thought about it for a long moment. "I'm going to buy a house," she said. "Something small, something simple, somewhere I can start over." "Where?" "I don't know yet. Maybe here in Grover's Mill, maybe somewhere else. The whole country is open to me now." She smiled. "That's a strange feeling, you know. Being free, having choices. I spent so long with no control over anything that I almost don't know what to do with all this freedom." "You'll figure it out," Sarah said, reaching over to squeeze Margaret's hand. "You always do." Margaret looked at her, this young woman who had shown her more kindness in 4 months than her own sister had shown her in a lifetime. "Thank you," Margaret said, quietly, "for everything. I don't know where I'd be without you and David. Probably still standing at the edge of the property, trying to figure out what happened to your house." Sarah grinned. "We're family now, Margaret. That's not going to change just because you move out." Family. There was that word again. The word that used to mean Diane. The word that used to mean pain and betrayal and 20 years of silence. But now it meant something different. Something better. It meant Sarah and David and their children. It meant Jessica, who still called every week to check in. It meant the community of Grover's Mill, who had welcomed Margaret back with open arms once they learned the truth about what had happened to her. It meant belonging, connection, love, real love, not the twisted, manipulative version Diane had pretended to offer. Margaret bought a house in September, a small cottage on the outskirts of Grover's Mill, about a mile from the Chen's place. It had a garden in the back and a porch in the front, and just enough room for one person to live comfortably. It wasn't her grandmother's house. It wasn't the home she'd shared with Robert. It was something new, something that belonged only to her. She planted flowers in the garden, roses and daisies and marigolds, the same flowers her mother used to grow. She hung curtains in the windows, simple white ones, nothing fancy. She put Robert's faded photograph on the mantel and her mother's wooden cross on the bedside table. And slowly, day by day, she started to build a life. She volunteered at the local library, helping kids with their homework the way she used to help her students. She joined the church choir, even though her voice wasn't what it used to be. She had dinner with the Chens every Sunday, watching their children grow and their family expand. Sarah's baby was born in May, a little girl they named Rose. Margaret Rose Chen, after the woman who had become, against all odds, part of their family. "You didn't have to do that," Margaret said, holding the baby in her arms, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, we did," Sarah replied. "You're her grandmother now, in every way that matters." Grandmother. It was a word Margaret had never expected to hear, a role she'd never expected to fill. But here she was, 73 years old, holding a baby named after her, surrounded by people who loved her. It wasn't the life she'd planned. It wasn't the life she'd lost. It was something else entirely, something unexpected, something strange, something beautiful. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Margaret Ellis was happy. On the one-year anniversary of her release, Margaret sat on her porch and watched the sun set over the Tennessee hills. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the 20 years in prison, the betrayal by her sister, the discovery that everything she'd believed was a lie, the confrontation in Arizona, the exoneration, the rebuilding. It had been the hardest year of her life, and also, in some ways, the best. She'd lost so much: her husband, her home, her savings, 2 decades that could never be returned. But she'd gained something too, something that couldn't be measured in years or dollars. She'd gained the truth about her sister, about her family, about herself, and she'd gained freedom. Not just freedom from prison, but freedom from the weight of loving someone who didn't love her back. Freedom from the hope that had kept her trapped for so long. Freedom from the past. She was 73 years old. She didn't have much time left, not compared to what she'd already lost, but she had enough. Enough to build a new life. Enough to love the family she'd found. Enough to finally, after all these years, be at peace. Margaret closed her eyes and listened to the sounds of the evening. The crickets chirping, the wind rustling through the trees, the distant laughter of children playing in a yard somewhere. This was her life now. This was her home. And no one, not Diane, not the past, not the memories of everything she'd lost, could take that away from her. Some stories don't have happy endings. Some stories end in tragedy, in loss, in wounds that never fully heal. But Margaret's story wasn't one of those. Margaret's story was about survival, about resilience, about the stubborn, defiant act of choosing to live, even when everything has been taken from you. She'd been betrayed by the person she trusted most. She'd lost 20 years of her life. She'd watched her husband die from behind prison walls, and she was still here, still breathing, still loving, still hoping. That was the real victory. Not the exoneration, not the money, not the confession that had finally revealed the truth. The real victory was simply this: Margaret Ellis had survived, and in the end, that was enough.